Welcome to Relaxing Subjects. Tonight, there is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. No thought you need to finish, no worry you need to solve before you let yourself rest. You have arrived at the end of the day, and the day has done what days do. It has passed. So let it. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves. Let the weight of your head settle fully into the pillow, and if it feels good to do so, take one slow breath in through your nose, gently, without forcing it, and let it out even more slowly than you took it in. That is all. Just that. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour glows on the clock beside you, whatever city or quiet room holds you in the dark, you are welcome here. If you feel like it, and only if it is easy, you might leave a small note later, some other time, telling us what time it is where you are, and where in the world you have curled up to listen. There is something kind about knowing that all across the earth, at this very moment, other people are lying just as you are, letting the same slow words carry them down into sleep. But that is for another time. For now, there is nothing to write, nothing to answer, nothing to hold. Just rest. Because tonight we are going to spend some time with a very old book. The oldest printed book in the world, in fact. And I want to tell you something about it right at the start, something that has always struck me as quietly astonishing. The kind of thing that seems to grow larger the longer you sit with it in the dark. This is a book that has survived for more than 1100 years, ink pressed into paper more than 1000 years ago, and still here. Still whole. Still legible. And yet, and this is the part I keep returning to, every single word inside it is about how nothing lasts. Nothing, not a thing in this world. The most enduring printed object that human hands have ever made is, from beginning to end, a teaching about impermanence, a permanent record of the truth that nothing is permanent. Sit with that for just a moment, softly. A book about letting go of everything that somehow refused to be let go of. A book that says all things pass and then proved it wrong simply by staying. We will hold that gentle paradox like a warm stone in the hand tonight. We will keep returning to it again and again the way the tide keeps returning to the shore. Because it is the heart of everything this book has to say, and it is, I think, exactly the kind of thing that can loosen your grip on the day and let you fall, softly, into sleep. You do not need to know anything about Buddhism to listen tonight. You do not need to believe anything, or remember anything, or understand anything. There will be a few old words in languages that are not our own, and each time one appears, I will set it down gently in plain English right beside it, so nothing ever feels heavy or strange. This is not a lesson. There is no test in the morning. If you drift off before I finish, that is not a failure, that is the whole point. That is the book doing its quiet work on you. So let the meaning wash over you the way warm water washes over your hands, and let yourself go whenever you are ready. Let me tell you first about the day this book was made. The 11th of May, in the year 868. Think of how long ago that is. More than 1100 years. And we know the date, not roughly, not as a guess by scholars squinting at old paper. We know it exactly, because whoever made this book pressed the date right into it. There is a line at the very end of the scroll, a small dedication, and in it the date is written out in the old way of measuring time in China. The 15th day of the 4th moon of the 9th year of the Xiantong era, which the calendars we use today translate to that spring morning, the 11th of May, 868. I find something almost tender about that. Someone stood at a workbench more than 1,000 years ago and dated their work, the way you might sign and date a letter, the way a child writes the day at the top of a page in school. They had no way of knowing that the date would still be readable long after their empire had fallen, long after their language had shifted and changed, long after everyone who had ever spoken their name was gone. They simply wrote the day. And the day survived, the 11th of May, a single spring morning held fast in ink for 11 centuries, still whispering its exact self to anyone who leans in close enough to look. And there is a name pressed into that dedication too. The book tells us who made it. His name was Wang Jie. And here is where the story becomes something warmer than a fact about old paper, because Wang Jie did not make this book to sell. He did not make it for a library, or a temple treasury, or to keep for himself. The little line at the end of the scroll says that it was reverently made, that is the word, reverently, made with care and with love, for universal free distribution, for anyone, for everyone, to be given away freely to whoever needed it, not sold, not traded, given, and he made it, the dedication says, on behalf of his two parents. Let that settle for a moment. More than 1,100 years ago, a man named Wang Jie wanted to do something good in the world, some quiet act of kindness that might ripple outward beyond his own small life. And what he chose to do was to make copies of a book of wisdom and give them away for free, and to offer that kindness in honor of his mother and his father. We do not know if his parents were still living. We do not know their names, or his face, or a single other thing about him, whether he was old or young, rich or poor, happy or grieving. We know only this, that he loved his parents, and that he expressed that love by giving something away. Isn't that a lovely thing to carry into sleep, that the oldest printed book in the world was, at its root, a gift? A son's gift, given in his parents' name, meant for strangers he would never meet. 1,100 years later, one of those strangers is you, tonight, in the dark, listening. In a way that Wang Jie could never have imagined, his gift has reached you. It found its way, across all those centuries, all the way to your pillow. Now, what was the book he gave away? What are these words that he thought were worth pressing into paper and scattering into the world like seeds? The book is called, in its own old language, the Vajracchedikā Prajñāpāramitā Sūtra. I know, that is a mouthful, and it is the last time tonight I will say the whole thing at once. Let me take it apart gently, one piece at a time, so that instead of a wall of strange sound, it becomes a small handful of soft, clear meanings. Prajñāpāramitā, it means the perfection of wisdom. The wisdom that has been carried all the way to the far shore, complete and whole. There is a whole family of these old texts, all of them called by that name, the perfection of wisdom, and they are among the most treasured writings in one of the great streams of Buddhism. This book is one of them. So already we have the perfection of wisdom. And then, Vajracchedikā, the one that cuts like a vajra. And here we need one more small word, and it is a beautiful one. A vajra. In the old Indian imagination, a vajra was two things at once, and both of them are worth holding in your mind as you drift. On one hand, it meant a diamond, the hardest thing there is, the substance that nothing else can scratch or break, the substance that can itself cut through anything. And on the other hand, it meant a thunderbolt, the flash of lightning, sudden and complete. The sky splitting open in an instant of pure brightness. Diamond and thunderbolt held in a single word, unbreakable hardness and sudden illumination. So when you put it all together, the title of tonight's book means something like this: the perfection of wisdom that cuts like a diamond. Or, if you prefer the other face of the word, the wisdom that strikes like a thunderbolt. A blade of the hardest, brightest thing imaginable, and what it cuts through is not stone or metal, it cuts through illusion, through the soft, sticky web of our own confusions, through everything we cling to that was never as solid as we believed. That is the promise held in the name. A diamond blade for the mind, come to cut you free. Most people simply call it the Diamond Sutra. A sutra, by the way, is just an old word for a teaching, a thread of teaching, the way you might call something a text or a scripture. The Diamond Sutra. That is all you need to hold. The diamond that cuts through illusion. Now, I told you this teaching is very old, and here is something I want to be careful and clear about, gently, because it is easy to muddle, and I would rather you drift off with the truth than with a knot. The book that Wang Jie printed in the year 868 is very old, but the words inside it are far, far older still. The teaching itself, the perfection of wisdom, was composed in India many centuries before that spring morning in China, somewhere in the span of time around 2,000 years ago. So by the time Wang Jie printed his copy, these words were already ancient. He was not writing them. He was passing them along, a gift handed down a long, long chain of hands, each one giving it forward until it reached his, and he pressed it into paper and gave it forward again. So there are really 3 ages nested inside this one object, like the rings inside a tree, and it is worth separating them softly so the wonder of it can grow. There is the age of the printed scroll itself, 1100 years and more. There is the age of the words, older still by many centuries, born in India in a language called Sanskrit. And there is a moment somewhere in the middle, a bridge between the two, when these Indian words were carried into Chinese by a translator, but that is a story for a little later, and a beautiful one, so I will hold it for you, and we will come to it gently in its own time. For now, just let the layers sit there, one inside the other, the way you might hold a small stone that you know is very old, and feel, without needing to explain it, the depth of time inside your palm. So, the perfection of wisdom that cuts like a diamond. That is what Wang Jie gave away. Now let me take you inside the book itself, to the very first scene, because the way it begins is one of my favorite things about it, and it is so calm, so ordinary, so free of drama, that it is almost like being told, shh, nothing alarming is going to happen here. You can relax. You might expect a book with a title like that, The Diamond That Cuts Through Illusion, the thunderbolt of wisdom, to open with something vast. Fire in the sky, a voice from the heavens, mountains trembling, some enormous cosmic event to match the enormity of what it is about to teach. It does not. It opens with a meal. The scene is set in a place called Śrāvastī, an old city in India where the Buddha and his community of followers were staying. And as the book begins, the Buddha does something wonderfully, almost startlingly ordinary. It is the time of day for the one meal that the monks took, and so the Buddha does what he did on any other day. He puts on his robe. He takes up his bowl. And he walks into the city to beg for his food. That is how it starts. Not with a miracle. With a man walking into town, quietly, holding an empty bowl, going from door to door, accepting whatever small kindness people chose to place in it. A little rice, perhaps, whatever was offered. He does not choose the finest houses. He does not skip the poor ones. He simply walks and receives and moves on. The most awakened being in the whole story, and here he is, doing the humblest thing a person can do, asking, gently, for something to eat. And then he walks back, and he sits down, and he eats his meal, just eats it. There is no description of anything grand. He is hungry, as anyone is hungry, and he eats, and when he has finished eating, he does the next ordinary thing. He puts his bowl away, and he washes his feet. I love that line so much. He washes his feet. Think of it, he has walked into the city and back on bare or sandaled feet, along dusty roads, the way anyone would, and his feet are dusty from the walking, the way your feet get dusty, and so, before he settles, he washes them. Clean and simple. The dust of the day, rinsed away with a little water, and only then, with his meal eaten and his bowl put aside and his feet washed clean, does he arrange his seat and sit down and grow still. And that is the moment the great teaching is about to begin. Not from a throne of gold, not in a blaze of light, from a man who has just eaten a simple meal and washed the day's dust from his feet, sitting quietly on the ground, at rest. I think there is something in that opening scene that is medicine for a tired mind at the end of a long day. Because it says, in its own soft way, that the deepest things do not live somewhere far away, up on some unreachable mountain guarded by difficulty. They live right here, inside the most ordinary moments of being a person. Eating when you are hungry. Cleaning what has gotten dusty. Sitting down when it is time to be still. The whole book, the diamond blade, the thunderbolt, the wisdom that cuts through every illusion, begins in the plainest possible way, with a meal and a bowl and a basin of water. Enlightenment tucked inside the ordinary, the way sleep is tucked inside this ordinary night. And into that stillness, someone speaks. Not the Buddha. At first, someone in the gathering rises, and it is he who asks the question that opens everything. And this person is going to be our companion for the whole of the book, so let me introduce him to you gently, because you are going to come to know him well over these hours, and I have grown quite fond of him myself. His name is Subhūti. Subhūti was one of the Buddha's senior disciples, one of the closest circle, an elder among them, someone who had been walking this path for a very long time. He was known for something particular, and it is a quality worth resting on tonight of all nights. Among all the disciples, Subhūti was the one renowned for dwelling in peace, for being able to abide quietly in stillness and openness, without grasping, without struggle. Of all of them, he was the one most at home in that spacious, peaceful quiet, which makes him, I think, exactly the right guide for a night like this one. If anyone can teach you how to rest without clutching, it is the elder who was famous for dwelling in peace. So picture him, an old man now, seasoned, one of the eldest there. He has been listening and practicing for many years, and in this scene, as the Buddha sits quietly after his meal, Subhūti rises from his place among the gathered disciples. And with great respect and great gentleness, he asks the Buddha a question. A large, sincere, human question. The kind of question that comes not from cleverness, but from a lifetime of caring about the answer. And everything that follows in this book, every turn of the diamond, every cut of the blade, every strange and beautiful reversal we are going to move through slowly together, all of it unfolds as a conversation. That is what the Diamond Sutra is. It is not a lecture. It is not a sermon shouted from on high. It is two people talking, softly, one asking and one answering, an elder disciple and his teacher, sitting together after a meal in the quiet of the afternoon, turning a great question over and over between them like a smooth stone passed back and forth from hand to hand. I find that immensely comforting, that the deepest teaching about letting go of everything comes to us not as a command, but as a conversation between two people who trust each other. There is no urgency in it. No one is trying to win. One person asks, honestly, and the other answers, patiently, and then the first one thinks about it and asks again, going a little deeper, and the answer comes again, a little deeper too, back and forth. Question and answer. Like the slow rhythm of breathing, like the tide which we will keep coming back to, like the rise and fall of your own chest, right now, as you lie there, listening, and that is where we will pause for tonight's first rest. We have only just begun, and already we have gathered so much to hold gently in the dark. So before we go any further, let us stop here for a little while and simply breathe. Take a slow, deep breath in. Let it be easy, not a big dramatic breath, just a full, unhurried one, drawing in slowly, quietly. And then let it out, even more slowly, releasing it the way you might set down something you have been carrying without realizing you were carrying it. Feel the pillow beneath your head. Feel the weight of the blanket or the cool of the air, whichever is holding you tonight. Notice, if you can, that in this exact moment, right now, there is nothing you need to do, nothing to hold, nothing to solve. Just this breath, and then the next one, and the slow, warm dark all around you. And when you are ready, there is no hurry, none at all. We will continue together. Let us stay with the wonder of what we have already touched, and let it deepen, softly, before we move on. Because I want you to feel the shape of the paradox once more, now that you know a little of the story. Now that you have met Wang Jie with his gift, and the Buddha with his washed feet, and Subhūti rising quietly to ask his question. Here is a book, a physical thing, ink and paper, made by human hands on a spring morning in the year 868. And what those hands were making, the words they were pressing so carefully into the paper, was a teaching that says everything you can touch, everything you can hold, everything made of parts and pieces and causes, is fleeting, passing, like mist, like a bubble on a stream. The book itself, the very paper and ink of it, is exactly the kind of thing the book says will not last, and yet it has lasted longer than almost anything else humans have ever printed. The teaching and the object seem, at first, to argue with each other. The words say nothing endures, and the object endures, but lie with it a little longer, in the dark, and the argument softens into something more like harmony. Because maybe the book has survived so long precisely because of what it says. Maybe there is something in a teaching about letting go that people wanted to protect, to copy, to pass forward, to give away for free, generation after generation, hand after hand. Maybe the very idea that nothing lasts is the thing that made people cherish this so tenderly that they carried it across 11 centuries. The book about impermanence became permanent because impermanence is the one truth every generation needs to hear, and every generation receiving it said, "Pass this on, keep this, give this away again." There is no need to resolve the paradox tonight. In fact, I would gently suggest you don't try. Just let it turn, slowly, like the conversation between Subhūti and the Buddha, question and answer, back and forth, no winner, no ending, only the slow rhythm of it rocking you towards sleep. A book that says all things pass, and stayed. a gift a son made for his parents that reached a stranger 1,000 years later, a diamond blade of wisdom that begins with a bowl of rice and a basin of water for dusty feet. Hold all of it loosely. That is the only way to hold anything in this book, loosely, without gripping. The book will keep teaching you that, over and over, in 100 gentle ways, until holding loosely becomes as natural to you as breathing. And I want you to notice, if you can, that we have not yet even heard Subhūti's question. We have only watched him rise. That is on purpose. That is the slow way, the sleep way, the way of a knight that is in no hurry to arrive anywhere. Because his question, when it comes, opens a door, and through that door is everything, the 4 illusions the diamond will cut through. The strange logic that says a thing is not the thing and therefore is the thing. The raft you leave behind at the river's edge once you have crossed, the astonishing moment when the Buddha asks whether he has attained anything at all through his awakening, and answers, no, not the slightest thing. All of that is waiting on the other side of Subhūti's question, and we will walk through it together, slowly, over the hours ahead, one soft step at a time, with as many pauses to breathe as you need. For now, though, let us simply sit a moment longer with the two of them in the afternoon light of Śrāvastī. The meal is finished, the bowl is put away, the feet are washed. The Buddha sits, still and at ease, the way you are learning to be still and at ease, sinking a little deeper into the bed with every breath. And the old man, Subhūti, the one famous above all others for dwelling in peace, rises from his seat with a question forming quietly in his heart, a question he has perhaps been holding for a very long time, the way you have been holding the small worries of your own day, carrying them without quite noticing. But he is about to set his down. He is about to lift it up and offer it, and in the offering, release it. That is what a real question is, if you think about it, a way of letting go of something you have been carrying alone. You hand it over. You give it away. And already, just by asking, you are lighter. You can do the same tonight, gently, in your own way. Whatever you have been carrying into this dark, the unfinished things, the worries, the small aches of an ordinary day, the dust of the road on your own tired feet, you do not have to solve any of it tonight. You can simply set it down beside you, the way the Buddha set down his bowl, and let the water wash it clean, and grow still. We have all the time in the world. There is no rush toward the answer. There is only this slow, warm conversation beginning between two people who trusted each other. More than 1,000 years ago, in the quiet after a meal, a conversation that someone loved enough to press into paper and give away, and that has travelled all this way, across all these centuries, to reach you here, tonight, exactly where you are. So let yourself sink a little further. Let the breath grow slower still. Subhūti is standing now, ready to speak. The elder who dwells in peace is about to ask the question that opens the diamond. And we will hear it, softly, in just a little while. There is no hurry at all, as we continue on, together, into the gentle dark. Before we go any further into the conversation itself, before we hear Subhūti speak, let us spend a little time with the object. The thing itself, the physical thing that has carried these words across 1150 years. Because it is worth slowing down for. It deserves that. Most things do, if we let them. The Diamond Sutra, as it exists today in the British Library in London, is a scroll. Not a bound book with pages you turn, not a tablet, not a codex with a spine, a scroll, the older form. A single long ribbon of paper that unfolds in your hands the way a river unfolds as you walk beside it. If you were to lay it out flat on the floor before you, it would stretch to roughly 5 meters, about 16 feet from end to end. Long enough that, unrolled entirely, it would reach from one side of a modest room to somewhere well past the opposite wall into another room entirely, into another part of the house. And it is made of 7 separate sheets of paper. 7 panels, each one printed individually, then glued together end to form this single long ribbon. You can see the seams if you look closely enough at the digitized images the international Dunhuang project has made available. 7 joins, 7 moments where one sheet met another and was pressed into continuity, and the join held, and the join still holds, more than 1,000 years later. Paper itself was still a relatively new technology in the world beyond China in 868. It had not yet reached most of Europe. And here it is, 7 sheets of it, joined and printed and rolled, carrying a text about the nature of impermanence. At one end of this scroll, before the text begins, there is an image, a woodblock frontispiece pressed into the paper the same way the words were, by the same technique, by the same hands, in the same workshop, on the same May morning in 868, or close enough to it. And this image, this picture, pressed into the oldest dated printed book in the world, is one of the oldest printed images in existence. Let yourself see it for a moment. Let it settle in behind your closed eyes. The Buddha sits on a raised platform or throne, draped in his robes, his left hand holding the edge of the cloth loosely, his right hand raised in a gesture of teaching, the fingers shaped in a particular way that in the visual language of Buddhist art means speaking, means the turning of the wheel, means the voice of wisdom finding the open air. He is calm. Utterly, completely, profoundly calm. There is nothing forced about it. It is not the stillness of someone trying to be still. It is the stillness of someone who has no reason to be otherwise. Seated before him, in a position of attentive respect, is an elderly figure. The elder Subhūti, one of the 10 principal disciples, the one the tradition calls foremost in dwelling in peace, foremost in the understanding of emptiness. He is older than most of the figures around him. You can feel it in the posture, a long life of practice held in the body quietly. He has just knelt, or is about to speak. The conversation is about to begin. Around them, filling the image with the texture of a world rather than an isolated encounter, are disciples and attendants and guardian figures, the larger community that witnessed this exchange, the ones who sat near enough to hear it and were changed by what they heard. And at the edges of the composition, at the lower corners of the image, there are 2 lions. Resting, still, present, the lion, in Buddhist iconography, is sometimes the symbol of the Buddha's voice, the lion's roar, which is what enlightenment sounds like when it speaks without hesitation. Here the lions are quiet. Composed, the roar has already happened or is about to. They are waiting, the way everything in that room must have been waiting, just before Subhūti opened his mouth. This image, this small, precise, beautifully carved image, pressed into a sheet of paper in 9th century China, is what you see when you open the scroll. It greets you first, before a single word of the teaching. It says, "Here is the scene. Here are the people. This is where we are. Now listen." The technology that produced it is called woodblock printing. Xylography, from the Greek words for wood and writing. Though in Tang Dynasty China, they would not have used those Greek words. They would simply have called it the craft, the method, the thing that the carver does. Here is how it works. and it is worth slowing down to understand it, because the understanding is part of the wonder. You begin with a smooth, flat block of wood. Fruitwood was often used, pear or jujube, dense-grained and even, resistant to splitting under the fine pressure of a blade. The carver takes the text, the characters written or brushed onto thin paper by a scribe, and lays it face down on the surface of the block, so the ink seeps through or transfers to the wood, leaving a faint, reversed impression. A mirror image of the page. The carver then takes a knife, fine and small, and begins to cut. Everything that should remain blank, the white space, the area around the characters, is cut away. Everything that should print, the strokes of the characters, the lines of the image, the thin outlines of the Buddha's robes, the curve of a lion's shoulder, is left standing, slightly raised above the surrounding surface. A relief, a carved geography of ink and absence. When the block is finished, a single block for each page or panel, the printer inks the raised surface evenly. A roller or a brush spreading dark ink across the standing strokes, then lays a sheet of paper over it and presses. Rubs the back of the paper with a smooth tool until the ink has transferred completely. Peels the paper away. And there is the page, perfect, readable, bearing every character in the same position as on every other page, printed from the same block. Not approximately the same. Exactly, identical, in a way that a hand-copied page, however careful, however beautiful, could never quite be. Each block could print hundreds of copies before the wood wore or warped. Potentially thousands. The same text, again and again, as many times as someone wished to press paper to wood. This is what was happening in China in 868 that was not yet happening in Europe. Johannes Gutenberg's movable type, the system of individual cast metal letters that could be rearranged and reused, would not arrive in Europe for another roughly 6 centuries, not until the 1450s, and it would transform the continent, remake the distribution of knowledge, give the Reformation its speed, change the world. What woodblock printing had already done, quietly, in China, centuries before, was a different but related revolution. The possibility of exact reproduction, of many identical copies, of a text that could spread without a scribe, that did not depend on the patience of a single careful hand. The Diamond Sutra is the oldest complete, dated printed book we know of that came from this revolution. The date pressed into its colophon, the 15th day of the 4th moon of the 9th year of the Xiantong era, which corresponds to the 11th of May, 868 C, makes it not merely old, but verifiably, specifically old. The date is printed into the object itself. The book declares its own age. It has been telling us, for 1150 years, exactly when it was born. Now, it is worth being careful here, and careful in a way that makes the claim richer rather than smaller. The Diamond Sutra is not the oldest printed thing ever made. There were earlier printed objects, some of them deeply significant in their own right. In Korea, a text called the Pure Light Dharani was printed sometime before 751 C, which would make it older than the 868 scroll. In Japan, a set of printed charms known as the Hyakuman Dharani, a million dharani, printed by imperial order to be placed inside a million tiny wooden pagodas, a vast and extraordinary act of Buddhist devotion, were produced somewhere around 764 to 770 C, also earlier than 868. These earlier printed things exist, they are real, and they are remarkable, and they matter, but they are single sheets. Charms, short texts on individual strips of paper. They do not carry a printed date within them that can be verified as a date of printing. They are not a complete book-length text in the sense that the Diamond Sutra, with its 7 joined panels and its sustained dialogue and its frontispiece image, clearly is. So when we say the Diamond Sutra is the world's oldest dated printed book, we mean precisely and only that. Dated, printed, book, all 3 qualifiers are doing real work. Take any one away, and the claim dissolves into something more complicated. With all 3 in place, the claim stands and has stood for as long as the object itself has been known to scholarship. The record is not a simple one, it is a specific, careful one, which somehow makes it even more impressive. And then there is another layer of time beneath the printing, another deeper stratum that we should settle into slowly. The scroll that was printed in 868 C is not the text that was composed in 868 C. The composition is far older. The teaching itself, the conversation between the Buddha and Subhūti, the questions and the answers, the raft parable and the diamond metaphor, and the closing verse about dewdrops and lightning, was not invented in 9th century China. It was written in India, in Sanskrit, composed somewhere in the long stretch of time between roughly the 1st century BC and the 1st century CE. It belongs to a family of texts called the Prajñāpāramitā, a word that means, very literally, the perfection of wisdom. This is the corpus, the library, the great accumulation of Mahayana Buddhist thought that explored, with extraordinary depth and consistency, what it means to see clearly, what it means to perceive the nature of reality without the distortions that ordinary grasping and clinging impose. The Diamond Sutra is one of the shorter texts in this family, brief enough to be memorized, dense enough to spend a lifetime with, a complete teaching in a small compass. The way a seed is a complete tree in a small compass. From India, in Sanskrit, these texts were translated into Chinese over the course of several centuries by a series of remarkable individuals who dedicated their lives to the enormous task of rendering one language's wisdom into another language's forms. The same text was often translated multiple times by different hands in different eras, with different shades of meaning and different literary qualities. The translation of the Diamond Sutra that was printed in 868 CE, the version that Wang Jie pressed into paper and gave away in honor of his 2 parents, was made by a man named Kumārajīva, and Kumārajīva is worth pausing with. He was born in Kucha, a city-state along the Silk Road, one of those extraordinary cosmopolitan places that the overland trade routes produced, where Indian, Persian, Chinese, and Central Asian cultures met and mixed and sometimes transformed each other. Kucha is in what is now the Xinjiang region of western China. In Kumārajīva's time, the 4th century CE, it was its own world, a kingdom of musicians and scholars and Buddhist monasteries and merchants moving between empires. His mother was a princess of Kucha, his father was an Indian Buddhist scholar. He grew up bilingual at minimum, saturated in Sanskrit texts from childhood, trained in the rigorous traditions of Buddhist learning. By the time he was a young man, he was already renowned, a scholar of unusual gifts, someone who could read a text in Sanskrit and not merely translate the words, but feel the thought behind them. The way a musician can hear a piece of music written in one language and render it faithfully and beautifully in another. His reputation reached the court of the later Qin dynasty in China. And here the story takes a turn that is both sad and strange, the kind of turn that real lives take and that history sometimes almost obscures with the weight of its own enormity. Kumārajīva was taken as a war prize. The later Qin forces, seeking him specifically for his scholarly gifts, captured him during a military campaign, and he spent years as a captive before finally being brought to the Chinese capital, Chang'an, sometime around the year 401 C. He spent the last years of his life there, in what was essentially a gilded captivity, honoured, supported, surrounded by monks and students eager to learn from him, but not entirely free, not quite his own man, far from his home. He died in 413 C, 12 years into his time in Chang'an, having translated into Chinese an astonishing body of texts. The Diamond Sutra among them, and the Lotus Sutra, and the Vimalakirti Sutra, and more. A library that shaped East Asian Buddhism for the next 1,500 years and continues to shape it today. What his translations are praised for, above all, is their literary quality. Kumārajīva did not simply transfer meaning from Sanskrit to Chinese. He listened for the music. He felt the rhythm of the original thought and tried to find the equivalent rhythm in a completely different language, different in grammar, different in tonal structure, different in the very way it builds meaning, and he produced translations that read, in Chinese, not as translations at all, but as original compositions. The cadences feel natural. The sentences have the quality of something that was thought in Chinese from the beginning, not carried across a border. This matters for how we hear the Diamond Sutra today. When the closing verse comes, the lines about the dream and the bubble and the dewdrop and the flash of lightning, we hear it with the particular music Kumārajīva gave it. Not Kumārajīva inventing the thought, which was never his. The thought was the Buddha's, or the traditions, expressed first in Sanskrit, composed over centuries of contemplation. But the specific sound of it, the particular weight and rhythm of the Chinese words pressed into that woodblock in 868, the music we still feel when we read those lines, that is partly Kumārajīva's gift. A man taken from his home who gave his whole life, willingly or not, to the work of carrying wisdom from one world to another. There is something worth sitting with in that. 3 moments in time, then, each one distinct from the others, and each one worth holding separately before we move forward. The first in India, somewhere in the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era. Teachers and scholars in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition composed the Vajracchedikā Prajñāpāramitā Sūtra, the perfection of wisdom that cuts like a diamond. They worked in Sanskrit within a long tradition of contemplative inquiry, trying to articulate something very precise about the nature of reality and the liberation that comes from seeing it clearly. The composition emerged over time, as such texts often do, shaped by multiple hands across multiple generations, until it settled into the form we recognize. The second, sometime around 401 to 413 C, in the city of Chang'an in central China, a scholar from Kucha named Kumārajīva sat with the Sanskrit text and rendered it into Chinese. He was far from home, in circumstances that were not entirely of his choosing. He worked with extraordinary care and extraordinary feeling, and the translation he produced was literary in a way that made it something more than a translation, a fresh statement of the same deep truth, in a new language, for a new world. The third, on the 11th of May, in the year 868 C, in the 9th year of the Shantong era of the Tang dynasty. A man named Wang Jie commissioned or supervised a workshop of carvers and printers who cut Kumārajīva's Chinese characters in reverse into wooden blocks, pressed ink-covered paper against them, page by page, glued the 7 printed panels together into a scroll with a frontispiece image of the Buddha and Subhūti and 2 resting lions, rolled it up and wrote the colophon at the end. Reverently made, the colophon says, for universal free distribution, on behalf of his 2 parents, and then it was given away. Or perhaps it was dedicated, placed in the care of a monastery or a shrine, with the intention that it be copied and shared. The precise path it took from Wang Jie's hands to Cave 17 at the Mogao Caves near Dunhuang, we do not know. We cannot trace every step. 1150 years is a long time, and most moments within it leave no record. But we know it arrived. We know it was placed in that cave among tens of thousands of other manuscripts, rolled and wrapped and stored with care. And we know the cave was sealed. And we know that, sealed and dark and still, it waited. That story, the sealing, the waiting, the reopening, the journey to London, belongs to the next part of our evening together. We will come to it, gently, in time. For now, let yourself rest with these 3 layers. The text composed in India, in the centuries near the beginning of things. The translation made in Chang'an by a man who had been carried far from his home and made the distance into a gift. And the printing, the physical pressing of ink into paper on a specific Tuesday in May, 11 centuries ago, by hands we will never name, in a workshop we will never find, that produced something that outlasted everything else they ever made or touched or loved. 3 moments, 3 acts of care, each one separated from the others by centuries, and all of them arriving here together in the single object that now rests in a drawer in London, in the dark, cool, stable air the British Library keeps for its most fragile things. There is something about that layering, the teaching, travelling through time, changing form, being carried by different hands, pressed finally into paper and given freely away, that rhymes with the teaching itself, the teaching that says nothing fixed, nothing permanent, nothing graspable as a thing. And yet it travelled, and yet it arrived, and yet it persisted, not because anyone forced it to, not because it was guarded jealously or locked in a treasury, but because people kept offering it, kept giving it forward, kept saying, "Here, take this, it has helped me, perhaps it will help you, I am not holding on to it, it is yours, freely given." That is how it survived. Let that settle for a moment, if you like. The way a warm thing settles, not forcing warmth, just holding it gently, letting it spread through you without effort. Let us pause here. Take a slow, deep breath, all the way in, feeling the lungs fill, the chest and belly lift gently, and then all the way out. Long, unhurried, let the breath go further than you expect it to. There is always a little more breath to release if you give it time. Notice where the body is resting against whatever is beneath you. The weight of the back or the side, the particular pressure of the pillow against the side of the face, the warmth of the blanket, the sounds of the room settling around you, ordinary, familiar, yours. You are here. You have arrived. The scroll is 5 meters long, 7 panels, the ink still dark, the lions still resting. 3 moments in time, and all of them travelling toward this moment, this room, this breath. You do not need to hold any of it. You do not need to remember it. It will be here when you wake, if you want it. Tonight, it simply passes through you like water through an open hand, and that is exactly as it should be. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is no rush. The teaching is patient. It has been patient for 1100 years. It can be patient for the length of 1 breath more. Take your time. And when the breath has settled again, and the body has grown a little heavier, and the room has grown a little quieter, we will turn toward the conversation itself, the one that was pressed into those 7 panels, the one that begins in the most ordinary way imaginable and opens, slowly, into something vast. Subhūti is waiting, the elder who dwells in peace, the one who, the tradition says, understood emptiness better than almost anyone, which is perhaps why he was chosen to ask the question. You need to understand emptiness quite deeply before you can ask about it without flinching. And the Buddha's answer, when it comes, will not arrive as a wall of doctrine or a system of belief. It will arrive the way all real answers arrive, if you've ever received one, gradually, obliquely, through questions and stories and small, quiet reversals that turn what you thought you knew gently inside out, so that you can see the lining, the texture underneath, the side that was always there but that the familiar surface had been hiding. The text the 868 scroll carries, Kumārajīva's Chinese translation of the Vajracchedikā Prajñāpāramitā Sūtra, is structured entirely as a dialogue. The Buddha speaks. Subhūti responds. The Buddha asks a question. Subhūti answers. The Buddha affirms or deepens or gently dismantles the answer, not out of cruelty, not to defeat Subhūti, but the way a good teacher dismantles a student's first right answer, revealing that the first right answer is also, in a deeper sense, incomplete, so that a second, richer understanding can grow in the space the first one opens. Back and forth, like two people in a quiet room after a meal, when there is nothing to prove and nowhere to be, and the light is warm, and the afternoon has grown completely unhurried, and so the real conversation can finally begin. This is what was printed. Not a list of doctrines, not a set of rules, a conversation. Two people, trusting each other enough to go all the way to the edge of what language can hold, and then leaning over together carefully to look. The text of this conversation belongs to the Prajñāpāramitā corpus, as we mentioned, the perfection of wisdom family of Indian Buddhist scripture. The Prajñāpāramitā texts range from the very short to the very long. Some versions run to hundreds of thousands of verses, vast oceans of repetition and elaboration that a scholar could spend a lifetime inside. The Diamond Sutra is at the short end, dense and concentrated, like something that has been pressed many times until only the essential remains. The way a good broth has been reduced slowly until it holds everything, short enough to memorize in a single sitting of devoted attention. Long enough to contain, the tradition says, the heart of the whole perfection of wisdom. And it was composed originally in a world and a time very different from Tang Dynasty China, different even from Kucha in the 4th century. It was composed in India, in the intellectual and spiritual ferment of the early centuries of the Common Era, when Mahayana Buddhism was articulating, with great philosophical precision and great poetic feeling, a set of ideas about the nature of reality that were not simple and not easy and not designed to comfort the ordinary mind in the ordinary way. They were designed, if anything, to disturb the ordinary mind's certainties, gently, thoroughly, with great compassion, so that something more spacious could open behind them. We will hear what those ideas sound like from the inside as the evening continues. We will hear how the text dismantles even itself, the extraordinary gesture of a teaching that instructs you in its own words, not to hold on to it. We will hear about the raft. We will hear what the Buddha says he attained, when he attained nothing at all. But for now, just this, the object, the scroll, the 7 panels glued end to end, the frontispiece with its 2 resting lions, the 3 layers of time, the composition in India, the translation by Kumārajīva in Chang'an, the printing in 868 by hands that believed this work was worth doing, that believed the press of ink into paper was an act of reverence, that believed a text about impermanence was worth making permanent, at least for a while, at least for long enough to travel, to be given away, to reach whoever needed it. Wang Jie's name is in the colophon. The two parents he honored are not named. They remain anonymous, the way so many of the people who made things possible remain anonymous, the ones who were loved, the ones for whom things were made and offered, the ones whose faces we will never see, but whose presence shaped everything that came to us. There is something tender about that, too. The body is growing heavier, perhaps. The thoughts are beginning to loosen from their edges, to blur slightly at the border where one thought ends and another begins. This is good. This is right. This is what a late evening does to the mind, if you let it, if you stop fighting it, if you allow the thoughts to float rather than pushing them toward resolution. You do not have to resolve anything tonight. Not the thoughts, not the worries, not the unfinished conversations in your head that have been running since this afternoon. You can simply observe them, the way you might observe clouds crossing a sky, present, real, and also moving, also changing, also not requiring you to do anything at all. We will continue together when the breath is quiet. The scroll is still unrolling, slowly, in the lamplight of a room that has been gone for 1100 years. And somewhere ahead of us in its length, past the frontispiece, past the opening lines, past the first gentle questions, the teaching is waiting. Patient as water, patient as a sealed room in a desert, patient as the dark. The word that names this text is Vajra. Let it land softly, like a stone placed on still water. Vajra, in the old language of Sanskrit. The language in which this teaching first took form, the word carries two meanings at once, and both of them are needed to understand what this scroll is doing. The first meaning is diamond, not in the sense of a jewel worn on a finger, though that is the image most of us carry. In the ancient tradition, diamond meant the hardest substance that exists, harder than anything that could be brought against it, impossible to cut, impossible to wear away. The diamond does not chip, it does not dissolve, it sits unchanged, while everything around it changes. The second meaning is thunderbolt, the bolt of lightning that does not merely illuminate, but cleaves. The sudden, absolute force that passes through material and leaves it split. In the iconography of this tradition, the Vajra was a weapon held by the gods, not to destroy life, but to cut through illusion, to cut through the idea that things are solid and permanent when they are not, to cut through the idea that you are fixed, settled, finished, the same person you were 7 years ago, to cut through the idea that the self is a stone when it is, in truth, more like a river. So the name of this text, in full, is the Vajracchedikā Prajñāpāramitā Sūtra, the perfection of wisdom that cuts like a diamond, or the perfection of wisdom that cuts like a thunderbolt. Both, a blade made of the hardest thing there is, wielded with the speed and certainty of lightning. Not to wound, to free. This is what Kumārajīva carried into his translation. Sometime around the years 401 to 413 of the Common Era, 6 centuries before Wang Jie would press it into the scroll, resting now in the British Library. Kumārajīva was a man who had been taken from his homeland as a prize of war, held for years, brought finally to the Chinese capital, and given the task of translating texts from Sanskrit into Chinese. He did not translate mechanically, word for word. He listened for the music of a sentence. He listened for the way an idea wants to move through a mind, not just through a dictionary. And so his version of the Diamond Sutra has a cadence to it, a rhythm that makes the words feel almost inevitable, as though they always existed in this form and were only waiting to be uncovered. The teaching he translated is structured as a dialogue, the Buddha and the elder Subhūti sitting together. A teacher and a student, though the roles shift in interesting ways as the conversation deepens. And at a certain point in the dialogue, the Buddha begins to do something that must have seemed, at first, almost like a puzzle. He begins to use words and then immediately to take them back. He says something like, the perfection of wisdom. And then, in almost the next breath, he says, that which is called the perfection of wisdom is not the perfection of wisdom. Therefore it is called the perfection of wisdom. If you were sitting in a room and someone said this to you, your first instinct might be to assume they had made an error, to wait for the correction, to think perhaps that they had simply misspoken and would clarify in a moment. But the clarification never comes. Because this is not an error, this is the move. Let us think about it slowly, the way we have time to think tonight, with no hurry, with the room settling around you and the breath already growing quieter than it was an hour ago. We use words to point at things. The word cup points at the object sitting on the table. The word sleep points at this gathering quiet in the body. The word perfection points toward something we imagine to be complete, whole, lacking nothing. And because the word is consistent, because cup means cup today and will mean cup tomorrow, we begin to believe that the thing it points to is also consistent, also fixed, also settled into its name like a stone into mortar. But the cup is changing. Slowly, at the level you cannot see with the eye, the molecules are shifting. The glaze is imperceptibly thinner. The clay beneath it carries the faint warmth of 1,000 mornings and is not quite the same clay it was. The word stays still. The thing it names is moving. The Buddha in the Diamond Sutra is pointing at this. He says, the perfection of wisdom. And then he says, do not cling to that name. Do not assume that because you have a word for it, you have grasped the thing. The name is a raft. The wisdom is the far shore. And as Kumārajīva translated this living paradox into Chinese, line by line, night by night, in a capital city that no longer stands in the form it had then, he gave it the sound it still carries 1,100 years later. That X is not X, therefore it is X. Not a riddle. A reminder that the map is not the territory, that the word is not the thing, that the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon, and if you fix your eyes on the finger, you will miss everything it is showing you. Take a slow breath here. Let the words rest. There is nothing you need to figure out. You do not need to solve the paradox tonight. You can simply let it be what it is, a door that opens not by being broken down, but by being leaned into, gently, until you realize it was never locked. When you are ready, we will continue. The dialogue moves deeper. And the Buddha turns to the question of the self. He names 4 notions that the text asks us, gently, to examine. Not to destroy. The teaching is not asking you to stop existing. It is asking you to look carefully at what you assume yourself to be. The 4 notions are the notion of a self, the notion of a being, the notion of a lifespan, the notion of a person. They sound, at first, like the same thing said 4 different ways, but they are 4 angles on a single question. What do you think you are? The notion of a self is the idea that there is a fixed centre, a you that is the same from morning to night, from year to year, from the child you were to the person lying in this bed tonight. The teaching does not say there is no experience happening. There is clearly experience happening, but it asks, where is this fixed center? Point to it, hold it still long enough to look at it. And what you find, if you are very quiet and very honest, is that it moves. That it is made of things, of memory, of habit, of the voice you use when you think about yourself, of the stories you have been telling since you were small. It is made of conditions, and what is made of conditions can, when the conditions change, be other than it was. The notion of a being is the sense that you are a separate unit, enclosed, bounded, distinct from everything around you. Here, inside, everything else outside, and yet the air you are breathing right now was outside a moment ago, and is inside now, and will be outside again in a breath. The food you ate this week is becoming, slowly and without your permission, the cells of your body. The boundary is real enough to be useful. It is not real enough to be absolute. The notion of a lifespan is the idea that you have a fixed span, a beginning that was yours, an ending that is coming, and a continuous self that travels between them like a boat on a river unchanged by the water. The teaching does not argue about the facts of birth and death. It asks, again, where is the thing that is unchanged? Show it to me. Hold it still. And the notion of a person is perhaps the most intimate, the sense that being a person means being something particular, something defined, something that could be pointed to and named. This one. Her, him, the one with the worry about tomorrow, the one with the memory of last Tuesday, the one who is tired tonight in a way that is hard to explain. The sutra does not say these things are false. It says they are not fixed. It says that clinging to them, gripping these notions as though they were the bedrock reality rather than the useful furniture of a life, is the source of a great deal of unnecessary weight. Let us explore a story about this. There was once a man who had carried a particular story about himself for many years. Not a dramatic story, not a story of great tragedy or great triumph, just a story, the kind most of us carry without knowing it. He thought of himself as the kind of person who could not sleep. He had decided this about himself sometime in his middle 30s after a difficult season, and he had kept the decision ever since. He carried it the way you carry something you stop noticing. The way you stop noticing the weight of the coat you have been wearing all day until the moment you set it down. One evening he sat with a very old teacher who asked him, "When exactly did you decide this? When exactly did you become a person who cannot sleep?" He thought about it. He remembered the difficult season. He named the year. And the teacher said, "So before that year you were a different person?" He said, "Yes, I suppose I was." The teacher said, "And between that year and this evening, were there nights when you slept?" He thought again. "Yes," he said. "Some, not many." The teacher said, "So the story is not quite accurate. It never was. And the person who decided it in that difficult year, is that person here now exactly? Or have you too been changing the way everything changes?" The man sat with this for a long time. He did not immediately feel lighter. He did not feel the story simply lift away. But something shifted, slightly, in the grip. The way a jar lid loosens when you run it under warm water, not open yet, but beginning to give. This is what the four notions ask of us. Not that we stop thinking about ourselves, not that we pretend the self is an illusion in the way that a magician's trick is an illusion, something that never was, but that we hold our notions a little more lightly, that we say, "This is what I have been, this is the shape I have been wearing, and it may not be as fixed as I thought, and that not fixedness is not loss. It is room." Quick reminder, After years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. The teaching turns now toward the act of giving. Dina is the Sanskrit word, and Kumārajīva carried it into Chinese with the weight it deserves. It means generosity. Not generosity as performance, not the kind that keeps a careful account of what was given and waits, consciously or not, for the acknowledgement, for the thank you, for the feeling of having been good. The Diamond Sutra is interested in a different kind of giving. It calls it giving without dwelling. Giving without dwelling means you give, and you do not make a home in the giving. You do not linger in the moment of the gift, turning it over in your mind, noting its value, wondering whether it was enough. You do not look to see whether the receiver understood what they received. You do not store the giving away as something you can return to on a difficult day and remind yourself that you are, at least, the kind of person who gives. You give, and then you let the giving go. The sutra puts it this way, and listen for the structure because it carries the same move as the X that is not X. A bodhisattva, someone practicing the perfection of wisdom, should practice giving with no attachment whatsoever to any notion of a giver, a gift, or a recipient. No giver, no gift, no recipient. Just the action itself, clean and complete, like a stone dropped in water that does not wait to see the rings it makes. Let us explore a story about this. There was once a woman who made bread. She was not young, her hands had been making bread for 40 years, and the work showed in the way she worked, the economy of motion, the absence of wasted movement. Each week she made more bread than she and her household needed. The extra loaves she left at the door of 3 different families in her neighborhood. She did not knock. She did not wait to be seen. She set the bread down and walked away. Her granddaughter asked her once, "Don't you want to know that they received it? Don't you want to know that it helped?" The old woman thought about this. She said, "The bread is for them. Once I've set it down, it belongs entirely to them. If I knock and wait and watch, I am still involved. I am still there, inside the gift, looking out of it. The gift is not quite whole yet." The granddaughter said, "But how do you know they are grateful?" The old woman said, "I don't." And that is, I think, exactly the point. This is what the sutra is gesturing toward. Not indifference. The old woman was not indifferent to those 3 families. She made bread for 40 years. That is not indifference. It is love so steady it does not need a mirror, so grounded it does not need a return. The sutra says that giving practiced this way, without a giver looking out of the gift, without a recipient existing as a fixed person who must respond in a fixed way, generates something immeasurable, something larger than treasure. Because the treasure eventually rusts, eventually scatters, eventually joins the long stream of things that were and then were not. But giving without dwelling teaches the mind a different movement. It teaches the open hand. Take a slow breath. The body knows how to do this. The hand can open. The breath can be released. You do not have to decide to exhale, the body knows. It was born, knowing. Whatever you are holding tonight, the worry, the to-do list, written in invisible ink on the inside of your eyelids, the conversation you replayed 3 times before dinner, you do not have to hold it. The body does not require it. The breath does not require it. You can simply let it rest on the surface of the quiet, the way a leaf rests on the surface of water without sinking. When you are ready, we will continue. The raft. Somewhere in the conversation between the Buddha and Subhūti, the Buddha tells a parable. He has been teaching. Subhūti has been listening, asking questions, receiving what is offered. And at a certain point, the Buddha pauses and says something like this. Suppose a man is standing on one shore of a wide river and needs to get to the other side. He gathers reeds and branches and pieces of wood and ties them together and makes a raft. And on that raft he crosses the river. Now he has arrived. He stands on the far shore. Should he then lift the raft onto his head and carry it with him wherever he goes? Subhūti says no, of course not. He should leave it at the shore, or perhaps let it float back out onto the water and go on his way without it. And the Buddha says, even so, I have taught you the Dharma, the teaching, the path, everything that I have offered in this long conversation and in all the conversations before it and after, as a raft, to help you cross, not to carry. One should let go even of the Dharma, the text says. How much more so of what is not the Dharma? Read that line slowly, the way you might read a letter that surprised you. One should let go even of the teaching. Even the diamond blade that cuts through illusion. Once you have used it, set it down. Even this text, this scroll, this conversation in the lamplight of an evening 1300 years ago, and in the lamplight of your own evening tonight, it is a raft. It is a pointing finger. Once you have crossed, you do not carry the raft. You thank it, perhaps. You remember it, perhaps. And then you walk forward, unburdened, on the far shore, which is quieter than you expected and more spacious than you dared to hope. Let us explore a story about this. There was a student who had been studying with a very fine teacher for many years. She had learned many things. She had learned how to sit with her thoughts without being thrown by them. She had learned how to breathe in ways that slowed her body when her body forgot how to slow itself. She had learned the names of several rivers in the tradition she was studying, and the names of the teachers who had taught beside them, and the names of the sutras those teachers had unrolled and read aloud. She had learned a great deal, and the learning had helped her. One evening she came to the teacher and said, "I think I have learned everything I came here to learn." The teacher said, "Good. What will you do with it?" She said, "I don't know. I thought you might tell me." The teacher said, "I have given you a raft. You used it to cross a river that was giving you difficulty. You are on the other shore now. What do you do with a raft when you are on the other shore?" She thought about this. She said, "I suppose I would leave it for someone else who might need it." The teacher said, "Yes. Leave it gently. Don't burn it, someone else may need to cross. Don't carry it either, it will slow you. Just leave it where someone can find it, and go on." She asked, "But what do I go on to? If I leave all the teachings here, what do I have left?" The teacher was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have the crossing. You have whatever changed in you while you were crossing. You have the far shore, which is not the same thing as the near shore, even though they look similar from a distance. And you have everything that will happen now, that you are not spending all your time carrying a raft." The student sat with this for a long time. She did not leave that night, or even that season. There were more crossings ahead of her that she had not yet noticed. But something shifted in the way she held the knowledge she had gathered. More loosely, the way you hold a handful of water, present, real, but not gripped, because gripping is exactly what makes water impossible to keep. This is the raft the Diamond Sutra is offering, not a doctrine to carry, not a belief to defend, not a scripture to be memorized and displayed as proof of having arrived somewhere. A raft, a crossing, and on the other side, whatever that side is, which the sutra does not describe in detail, because descriptions of the far shore are another thing to cling to, you set the raft down. There is something deeply restful about this, if you let it be. You do not have to carry anything tonight. Not the raft, not the river, not the far shore, not even the idea of crossing. You can simply be here, on the surface of your breath, in the quiet of the room, in the slow and unremarkable mercy of a body that knows how to rest even when the mind is still offering suggestions about how the night should go. Let the suggestions float. You do not have to act on them. Take a slow breath. Here, notice the chest rising and releasing. Notice that the exhale is not an effort, it is a letting go that the body performs thousands of times a night without asking your permission. The body knows how to release. You were built for this. When you are ready, we will continue together. Subhūti asks a question. He has been listening to all of this, the non-dual logic, the four notions to release, the teaching about giving without dwelling, the parable of the raft, and now he turns to the Buddha and asks the question that has been quietly gathering beneath all the others. He asks something like, "Did you attain anything at all through supreme, unsurpassable enlightenment?" And the Buddha's answer is among the most disarming things in all of this tradition. He says, no. There is not the slightest thing to be attained. Not the slightest thing. This is not false modesty. This is not the rhetorical humility of a teacher downplaying what they know. This is the teaching itself, applied to the teaching itself. If enlightenment were a fixed object, a prize sitting at the end of a path, waiting to be picked up and carried home, then attaining it would mean clinging to it. And the entire movement of this text has been toward releasing the grip, not tightening it. So the Buddha says, there is no fixed thing called enlightenment that I grasped and now possess. There is only this clarity, this seeing without holding, this being here, in the conversation with Subhūti, in the morning light of Śrāvastī, with the meal eaten and the feet washed and the cushion settled. Not the slightest thing. The sutra says in another passage, there is no such thing as a fixed teaching that the Tathagata has taught. The Tathagata is another name for the Buddha. It means something like the one who has thus come, or the one who has thus gone, and the ambiguity is intentional. Coming and going at once, arriving without a fixed point of arrival. The teacher who has come to teach and is already, in some sense, already gone, already released from the role, already not clinging to the identity of teacher. No fixed teaching, no fixed attainment, not the slightest thing. Let us explore a story about this, one that the tradition has held on to for a long time, not because it proves something, but because it helps. There was a young person, many years ago, who wanted very much to be calm. This was a genuine desire, not a performance. They had watched people they loved suffer from a quality of restlessness that seemed to cost them everything, and they had decided early that they would be different. They would achieve peace. They would practice until they arrived at the place where the restlessness could not find them. They sat and breathed. They read and studied. They travelled to find teachers. Each teacher they found said something useful. Each teaching helped them cross a river, and after each crossing they felt, for a moment, that they had arrived, that this was it, the far shore, the settled place, the peace they had been seeking. And then, a week later, or a month later, or sometimes only a few hours later, The restlessness returned. Different in character, not the restlessness of a young person who does not know where they are going. More refined, but present nonetheless. After many years they sat with a teacher who was very old, and they described all of this. They said, "I have been seeking peace for 20 years, and I cannot seem to arrive. Where is it?" The old teacher said, "You are looking for a thing. Peace is not a thing." They said, "What is it then?" The teacher said, "It is more like a quality of how you are holding the moment you are already in. You have been looking for a destination. The destination does not exist. Or rather, you are already standing on it, and because you are looking ahead, you cannot see that the ground beneath your feet is exactly what you were searching for." They sat with this. They said, "But I feel restless right now." The teacher said, "Yes." "And?" They said, "And that means I haven't arrived." The teacher said, "Or it means you are a person who is sitting here, in this moment, feeling restless, and that the restlessness is not a barrier between you and peace, but simply part of what is here right now. You don't have to make it go away. You don't have to attain anything. You just have to be willing to be here, with exactly what is here, without requiring it to be different. Not the slightest thing to be attained, just this: the room, the breath, the body growing heavier in the dark." Subhūti, at a certain point in the dialogue, is moved to tears. This is one of the details of the Diamond Sutra that is easy to pass over because it appears in a single sentence and the narrative does not linger on it. But it deserves a moment. Subhūti is not young. He is the senior disciple, renowned above all others for his understanding of emptiness, of the deep, careful seeing that recognizes the non-fixed nature of things. He has been on this path a long time. He has heard many teachings. He has, one might assume, heard most of what there is to hear. And yet when the Buddha speaks the words of this sutra, Subhūti weeps. He says something like, "Hearing this teaching, I now understand truly and deeply. And from the beginning, from the first moment I sat with you and began to understand, I have never thought to myself, I am one who has attained something. I have never thought, this is what I possess. Because to have thought, that would have been to grasp. And the whole of what you have been teaching is the releasing of the grasp." He weeps because the teaching is so complete, because it closes the loop so cleanly, because the perfection of wisdom is not something you arrive at and keep, it is the movement of arriving and releasing, the way the breath arrives and releases, without asking permission, without needing a thank you, without storing itself up to be spent later on more important days. What moves Subhūti to tears is not sadness, it is recognition. The kind that can only come after a long time and a great deal of practice, the recognition that arrives not as a new idea, but as the settling of a weight you did not know you were carrying. Like setting down a coat you have been wearing all day. Not relief exactly, not triumph. Something quieter than both. Something like, oh, of course. It was always this way, and I was always already here. Take a slow breath. There is no need to hold yourself up right now. The bed is doing that. The room is doing that. The slow and generous physics of a quiet night are holding everything you are. Exactly as you are. The tired muscles, the loosening thoughts, the breath that comes and goes without you having to manage it. You do not have to attain anything tonight. Not sleep, even. Sleep comes for those who stop chasing it. The body knows. The body was doing this long before the mind had opinions about it. Rest here. Let the teaching settle. Not as an idea you now need to organize and file and remember, but as a quality, a slight softening of the grip on the day, on the self that has been holding everything together since morning. You do not need to hold everything together right now. The conversation between the Buddha and Subhūti is still unfolding in the scroll. We have covered a great distance together tonight, through the teachings that Kumārajīva carried into Chinese, through the logic that cuts not by force but by clarity, through the four notions held and gently released, through the raft left at the shore, through the answer that offered not the slightest thing as the whole of what is attained. Subhūti's tears have dried. The morning in Śrāvastī is still and golden. And ahead, in the remaining length of the scroll, pressed onto paper on a May morning more than 1100 years ago, sealed eventually in darkness, waiting. Something is still coming. The last gift, the final words that Kumārajīva translated, and that Wang Jie pressed into wood and paper and sent out into the world as an act of love for two people whose names he did not need to write, because the love itself was the point. We are not there yet. The night has a little more length to it. The scroll has a few more feet of paper still to unroll. Let the breath be slow. Let the body be heavy. Let the thoughts continue their floating, the way clouds continue across a sky, regardless of whether anyone is watching, regardless of whether anyone decides that they should. We will continue together, in the dark, in the quiet, in the slow and patient movement of a night that is in no hurry at all. There is a place in the desert where the cliffs are the colour of old honey. The desert itself is the Gobi, and the cliffs rise at the edge of an oasis town called Dunhuang, in a province that is now called Gansu in the far northwest of China, where the old roads of the Silk Route came together the way rivers come together, not always gently, but inevitably. People had been stopping at Dunhuang for centuries by the time Wang Jie pressed ink to paper in 868. Merchants rested their camels there. Pilgrims replenished their water. Monks translated texts in the shade. It was a crossroads not just of goods but of languages and of ideas and of faiths, Buddhism and Daoism and Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism and Islam, all moving along those roads like slow weather, each tradition finding small footholds in the sandy soil, each leaving something behind. And into the cliffs at Dunhuang, over the course of 1,000 years, beginning in the 4th century and continuing into the 14th, people carved rooms. Nearly 500 of them. They carved them by hand into the soft rock, lit lamps inside, and painted every surface they could reach, walls, ceilings, archways. With Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and guardian kings and celestial musicians, and scenes from the sutras and visions of paradises so detailed and so tender that looking at them, even now, even in photographs, you feel the quiet intention behind every painted line. The site is called the Mogao Caves, which can be translated as the Caves of Transcendence or the Caves of Nothing Above. The name carries a meaning about height and emptiness that is fitting in ways the namers may not have entirely intended. The world now knows them also as the Caves of 1,000 Buddhas. The United Nations has designated the site a World Heritage Monument, which is a formal way of saying that what was made there belongs to the world, which is a complicated thing to say, for reasons we will come to. Among those nearly 500 rooms, there is one that was hidden. Cave 17. It sits, or sat for a long time, behind a painted wall inside a larger cave. Small by the standards of its neighbours, a modest, low-ceilinged chamber, roughly the size of a generous closet, but what it held was not modest at all. Someone, at some point around the year 1000 C, placed inside that chamber tens of thousands of manuscripts, scrolls and bound texts and loose sheets and printed charms and calendars and contracts and letters and sacred texts in Chinese and Tibetan and Sanskrit and Sogdian and other languages whose speakers had long since vanished from the roads. They stacked them, layer on layer, until the room was dense with paper and silk, and then they plastered over the entrance. They sealed it shut, smoothed the plaster, painted a mural over the surface so that the doorway disappeared into the wall, and walked away. For almost 900 years, no one opened it again. There is a question that the scroll itself, our scroll, the Diamond Sutra, lying somewhere inside that packed room, could not have asked or answered. Why was the cave sealed? Who made that decision, and what were they thinking as they pressed the last layer of plaster over the entrance and stepped back into the light? The question is genuinely open. Scholars have offered several careful possibilities, and none of them has settled it, and perhaps it will never be settled. One idea is that the room was a kind of archive for sacred texts that had been worn out or damaged, manuscripts that were too holy to destroy but too frail to use, given a dignified retirement inside a rock. Another idea is that someone was hiding the texts from a threat that was approaching, the Shishya, the Tangut people, who came to control this region in the early 11th century, and whose arrival might have seemed, to the monks of Dunhuang, like something worth preparing for. A third idea is simpler, and perhaps sadder. The cave was filled during a period of rapid change. The monks who sealed it scattered or died, and the knowledge of what lay behind that plastered wall simply did not survive to be passed on. Not hidden. Forgotten, the desert is good at keeping secrets. The dry air of the Gobi preserved what the darkness held. Paper that would have crumbled in a humid climate held together in that sealed chamber, century after century. While dynasties rose and fell outside, while the Silk Route fell quiet and the oasis towns along it faded, while the carved caves of Dunhuang were tended by fewer and fewer hands, while the plaster dried and cracked and the painted mural over Cave 17's entrance was scuffed by wind-blown sand and the years. 900 years is a long time. It is almost exactly the distance in time that separates us now from the moment the cave was sealed. The man who opened it again was not an archaeologist. He was a Daoist monk, a caretaker who had come to the Mogao Caves and found them in a state of decay and appointed himself, without official authority, their guardian. His name was Wang Yuanlu, and by the accounts that survive, he was a modest, earnest, slightly eccentric figure who devoted years of his life to the slow work of clearing sand from the cave entrances and repairing what he could repair, and hoping, in the way that people who work alone in remote places often hope, that someone in authority would eventually pay attention to what he was doing and help him do it properly. Around the year 1900, during some clearing work, he or one of the men working alongside him noticed something wrong with the wall. A sound, perhaps, a hollow note when something was tapped. A seam in the plaster that did not quite match its surroundings. The wall was opened, and there was the room. Wang Yuanlu, standing in the lamplight at the entrance to Cave 17. Looking at the tens of thousands of manuscripts packed inside, could not have known what he was looking at in any full sense. He could not have known that among those scrolls was a particular 7-panel document with a date printed inside it that would, when scholars eventually read it, establish the earliest known dated printed book in human history. He was a Daoist monk in a remote oasis, standing alone in front of a closet full of old paper. He wrote letters to provincial officials. He sent samples of the manuscripts. He waited for someone to care enough to come. 7 years passed. In 1907, a man arrived. His name was Aurel Stein, and he was a Hungarian-British archaeologist who had spent years travelling the Central Asian routes, excavating and documenting and collecting artefacts along the Silk Road. He had heard about the cave and its contents, and he came to see for himself. He and Wang Yuanlu negotiated, if negotiation is the right word for an exchange conducted in different languages, with different understandings of what was being exchanged. What is settled is that Stein left with thousands of manuscripts, including our scroll, the dated Diamond Sutra, and that he paid Wang Yuanlu a sum that accounts describe as around £130 sterling for the lot. He brought them to London. There is no way to say this simply and make it simple, because it is not simple. What Stein acquired from that cave is now held by the British Library, catalogued under the shelfmark OR 8210/P2. Visible to scholars and conservators who have been able to study it, digitize it, and preserve it with resources and expertise that may not have existed had it remained in a poorly funded cave in a remote corner of China. And it is also true that the manuscripts left without clear consent, without proper authority, for a sum that bore no relationship to their significance, and that questions about where they belong and who they belong to have not been resolved and may not be resolved in our lifetimes. Both things are true. The ethics of the 1907 acquisition are contested to this day. And it is not the work of a single night's narration to settle what historians and governments and cultural institutions have not settled in over a century. What we can say is that the scroll exists, that it survived, and that it is now, in some form, in some complicated custody, part of the world's account of itself. The British Library conservator Mark Barnard spent years working carefully on the scroll, completing a major conservation project around the year 2010. He and his colleagues stabilized the fragile paper, repaired the seams where the 7 panels met, ensured that what had survived 900 years of darkness and over a century of handling and study would continue to survive. The scroll is now digitized, every inch of it, and available through the International Dunhuang project, which is a collaboration of libraries and institutions around the world working to document and share what the library cave held. You can look at the Diamond Sutra online. You can see the frontispiece, the woodblock printed image of the Buddha addressing Subhūti, the guardian figures. The 2 lions on either side. You can read Wang Jie's colophon in its original block printed Chinese. You can see the precise, even pressure of the ink on paper pressed by someone's hands 1100 and more years ago. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a slow breath in. Let it go. The scroll made it. Through the ceiling and the darkness and the desert and the opening and the long journey, and the arguments that have not ended, and the hands of a conservator working in a London library with tools that no one in 868 could have imagined. It made it. The words are still there. And this is where the paradox deepens into something almost too large to hold comfortably, which may be exactly the point. The Diamond Sutra is a teaching about impermanence, about the unreliability of all conditioned things, about the impossibility of grasping, of holding, of securing anything against the nature of change. And yet this particular copy, Wang Jie's copy, pressed on the 11th of May in the year 868, made as an act of love for 2 unnamed parents, and released into the world for free, has outlasted nearly every other object made by human hands in its century. The nations whose coins were in circulation when Wang Jie made his scroll are gone. The dynasties are gone. The languages carved into other scrolls in Cave 17 are, some of them, extinct. The roads that connected Dunhuang to the world have been quiet for centuries. And the Diamond Sutra, the teaching that compares all compounded things to a dream and a dewdrop, sits in a climate-controlled room in London, archived and digitized and studied and translated into dozens of languages. More preserved and more permanent than almost anything that has tried to be permanent. You do not need to resolve that paradox to rest in it. You can simply notice that it is there. When you are ready, let us continue. There is a story held in a text called the Platform Sutra about a man who heard a single line from the Diamond Sutra and something in him came undone. Not in a painful way. In the way that a knot sometimes simply releases because the moment is right and the thread is ready and no force is required. The man's name was Huining, and he would become what the Chan school of Buddhism, the school that Japanese Zen developed from, calls the sixth patriarch, the sixth in a line of transmission from the founding teacher Bodhidharma. But the story about Huining begins before any of that, in a moment of ordinary poverty. He was, by the traditional account, illiterate. He sold firewood to support himself and his aged mother. One day, delivering wood, he heard a customer reciting a line from the Diamond Sutra. The line, in Kumārajīva's Chinese, the same translation printed in 868, the same words Wang Jie committed to paper, said something that can be rendered as, "Let the mind arise without dwelling on anything." Let the mind arise, without dwelling on anything. Huining heard it and stopped. He asked the customer what text that was from and where one might go to hear more. The customer directed him to a monastery, and Huining travelled there and eventually became a student of the fifth patriarch, Hongren, and learned and practiced, and eventually, through that one line, that one instruction, that single invitation to let the mind be what it is without requiring it to settle anywhere permanently, Huining reached what the tradition calls awakening. His understanding was so clear, so accurate, so resonant with the depth of the teaching, that the fifth patriarch chose him as successor, which is itself a long story with its own complications and beauties. But the point, for tonight, is smaller and closer. Let the mind arise without dwelling on anything. You have been lying here, perhaps, with the mind arising. Thoughts about the day just finished, or the day not yet begun, or the people you love and the people who make things difficult, and the things you are carrying that no one else can quite see. The thoughts come. They arise. They arise the way thoughts always arise, not because you are broken, not because you are bad at sleeping, not because something is wrong with you, but because you have a mind, and this is what minds do, in the dark, in the quiet, when the day's business is done, and there is no more task to point the attention toward, and the attention therefore turns, as it has always turned, toward whatever is unresolved. Let it arise and move. You do not have to make it dwell anywhere. You do not have to catch it and hold it and examine it tonight. The thoughts can come and keep moving, the way water moves over stones, touching them, being changed slightly by them, and continuing. You do not have to grasp the water to keep it moving. It will move on its own. Let the mind arise without dwelling on anything. This was the line that stopped Huining in the middle of a firewood delivery somewhere in China more than 1,000 years ago. Perhaps the same line, or something very close to it, can travel across all that time and find you here, in the dark, in whatever room you are resting in tonight, and offer itself quietly for your use. You do not have to do anything with it. You can simply let it sit nearby like a warm lamp. Take a slow breath. Let the body settle just a little more. We are almost at the end of the scroll, the final lines of the Diamond Sutra, the last thing Wang Jie pressed into paper, the last thing Kumārajīva translated from Sanskrit into Chinese. The last gift the text offers before it folds itself into silence are a verse. In the tradition they are called a geth, which simply means a verse or a set of lines meant to be held in the mind, a distillation so compact it can be carried without effort, the way a seed carries a whole tree. The verse comes after everything that has been said and patiently dismantled, after the four notions, after the raft, after the answer of not the slightest thing. It comes after Subhūti's tears have dried, and the morning in her vast is still and golden. It is the last thing. Kumārajīva's Chinese gives us 6 images, 6 things the sutra asks you to see all conditioned phenomena as. All conditioned phenomena, which means everything that arises from causes and conditions, which means essentially everything in ordinary experience, which means the thoughts in your mind tonight and the weight of your body, in the bed and the room around you and the memories of the day and the plans for tomorrow and the self who is listening and the voice that is speaking and the scroll itself and the lamp that lit the carver's work on. The wooden block in 868 and the darkness of cave 17 and the desert wind, outside and the long journey of this text through languages and centuries, and a sealed room, and a contested acquisition, and a conservator's careful hands. Everything that arises, everything that is conditioned, everything that comes into being through causes, and then, in its time, passes. All of it, the sutra says, is to be seen as a dream, and an illusion, and a bubble, and a shadow, and dew, and a flash of lightning. Let each one settle for a moment before the next arrives. A dream. You know what a dream is. You have had them. You wake from a dream, and the objects in it were entirely convincing while you were inside them. The room was a room. The fear was fear. The person beside you was real. The urgency was genuine, and then you open your eyes, and none of it was there. Not because it was false exactly, but because it was conditioned. It arose from the state of sleep and the workings of the mind, and when those conditions shifted, the dream shifted with them. The dream did not pretend to be permanent. It only felt that way from inside. An illusion, a thing that appears to be one thing and is another, not a lie exactly, not a deception exactly, but a misreading. A way that perception offers us a version of what is there that is not quite what is there. The sutra does not say the world is nothing. It says we read it a certain way, and the reading is not the same as the thing. A bubble. You have watched a bubble in water, in a stream, in a cup of tea, in rain falling on a puddle. A bubble arises. It has a surface, a roundness, a brief completeness, and then it pops and the water is water again, with no mark of where the bubble was. The bubble was never separate from the water. It was the water temporarily organized around a pocket of air, temporarily wearing the form of a sphere, and then the condition that made it a bubble passed, and it became water again. A shadow. A shadow has edges and moves and can be very large, and it is entirely dependent on a source of light that it is not. Take away the light, take away the object that interrupts the light, and the shadow does not go anywhere, it simply was never a thing. only a relationship between things. Dew. In the early morning, before the sun has fully risen, there are small perfect drops of water on leaves and blades of grass that were not there the night before. They form in the night, quietly, as the temperature drops, as moisture condenses, a process of causes and conditions producing something small and precise and briefly beautiful. And then the sun rises, and the dew rises with it, back into the air, having been water, having been a small bright sphere on a blade of grass, having been gone. A flash of lightning. A flash of lightning does not last long enough to be grasped. By the time you have seen it, it is over. It lights the whole sky, and then it is dark again. Darker than before. And what you are left with is the image on the inside of your eyes, not the lightning itself, which has already gone, but the trace of it, the after-image, which is itself already fading. These are the 6 things Kumārajīva's translation offers. The verse, in all its fullness, says that all conditioned things are to be seen this way. Not feared this way, not mourned this way, seen this way. This is an important distinction, and it is one of the places where the Diamond Sutra is most easily misread. The verse is not nihilism, it is not asking you to despair of the world or conclude that nothing matters because nothing lasts. Quite the opposite. It is an instruction in how to see. When you see a bubble and call it a bubble, you are not denying the bubble its brief completeness. You are honoring what it actually is. When you see a flash of lightning and call it a flash of lightning, you are not dismissing the light it briefly makes, you are understanding its nature. The sutra is asking you to hold experience the way you hold a bubble in a stream. Present with it, appreciating it, not clutching it, not requiring it to be other than what it is, and not suffering when it returns to water, because you understood all along that water was what it was. The things you are carrying tonight, the worry, the replayed conversation, the thing you said or did not say, the uncertainty about what comes next, the fatigue beneath the fatigue, all of these are conditioned things. They arose from causes and conditions, from the day, from the history behind the day, from the mind, from the body. They are real, they are not nothing, but they are also not permanent. They are also dream, illusion, bubble, shadow, dew, lightning. They arose. In their time, they will pass. Not because you have grasped them hard enough to work them into resolution, but because that is the nature of conditioned things. You do not have to solve anything tonight. The sutra says so. And the sutra was made 1100 years ago by someone who loved his parents enough to press a book of wisdom into paper and release it into the world with the instruction that it be given away freely to anyone who would receive it. For universal free distribution. That is what the colophon says. Wang Jie made this not to possess, not to sell, not to preserve as a monument to himself, not the slightest trace of his own name attached to it as a claim. He made it as an act of love, and he let it go. And it went. Into a room in Dunhuang, eventually, into 900 years of darkness, into the hands of a Daoist monk who found it and did not know what he had found, into a contested negotiation with a Hungarian-British archaeologist who carried it to London, into the care of conservators, into the archive, into the digital light, into the world again, available now to anyone who wants to look. The book about impermanence is itself impermanent, passing from hand to hand, changing in form, held by different custodians under different circumstances, being read in languages that did not exist when it was carved, being listened to in the dark by people in rooms that Wang Jie and Kumārajīva could not have pictured. And still the words are the same words. Still the instruction is the same instruction. A dream, an illusion, a bubble, a shadow, dew, a flash of lightning. Let us pause here, in the quiet. Take a slow breath in through the nose, and let it go. Notice what has settled, the body against whatever is beneath it, the slight softening at the edges of the thoughts, the way the room has been growing quieter, perhaps, not because anything has changed about the room, but because something in the listening has grown a little more still. When you are ready, we will come to the end together. There is one more thing to notice before we close. The scroll itself, or 108210/P2, held in the British Library, 5 meters long and made of 7 panels of paper glued end to end, begins with an image. The woodblock frontispiece, one of the oldest printed pictures in existence, shows the scene we have been inside all evening. The Buddha, sitting, around him, the disciples, guardian figures at the edges, 2 lions, and across from the Buddha, in the position of dialogue, the elder Subhūti, the one the tradition calls foremost in dwelling in peace, foremost in understanding emptiness. The one who asked the question that opened the sutra, how should one who has set out on the path of the Bodhisattva stand and walk and still the mind? The image is pressed in ink on paper, made by a carved wooden block produced in the year 868, sealed in darkness for 9 centuries, and then reopened and studied and preserved and digitized so that now anyone anywhere can look at it. The Buddha in the image is mid-conversation. Subhūti is attending. The moment is not frozen. It gives the impression, the way good images sometimes do, of being caught in the middle of something ongoing, something that did not finish when the picture was pressed, but simply continued, in the ink, in the paper, in the dark. The conversation is still happening. That is one way to think about it. Every time someone reads the Diamond Sutra, every time someone recites it or studies it or listens to it in the dark while trying to fall asleep, they are, in some sense, rejoining that conversation. Entering the morning in reversed, sitting within earshot of the exchange between a teacher and his most peace-dwelling student, receiving, again, the invitation to look at conditioned things as dream and bubble and dew and lightning, and to loosen, accordingly, the grip on whatever the hands of the mind have been holding. This is what the sutra calls merit. Not a transaction, not a reward earned for good behavior, but something closer to what happens in you when you genuinely understand something. A small internal rearrangement, a slight release, an opening that was not there before. The text says even 4 lines of this sutra, genuinely received, outweighs any material gift that could be offered. Not because the lines are magic, but because what they offer, the shift in how you see, is more valuable than any object. You can lose an object. You can be separated from it, as Wang Jie released his scroll, as the monks of Dunhuang lost access to their sealed manuscripts, as Aurel Stein carried the scroll from its cave to a continent it had never known. But a change in how you see cannot be taken. Once you have seen the bubble as a bubble, you do not unsee it. Once you have crossed the river on the raft and understood that the raft is for crossing and not for carrying, you do not forget the shore. Once you have sat with Subhūti in the morning in Śrāvastī and heard the answer, not the slightest thing, you carry a small, clean, weightless thing with you. The thing that is not a thing. The attainment that attained nothing, and it is lighter than anything you set down to receive it. You do not need to remember all of this. That is something the tradition says explicitly, and it is worth saying again now, here, at the close of the night. You do not need to remember the colophon, or the shelfmark, or the name of the Daoist caretaker, or the date the conservation was completed. You do not need to hold the 6 images of the closing verse in the right order, or be able to name the Kukian translator and his date, or explain the distinction between the dated printed book and the earlier undated charms. None of that is the point. If one thing stayed, a single image, a moment of loosening, the feeling of the bubble forming and releasing, the quietness of Subhūti's tears in a golden morning, the instruction to let the mind arise without dwelling on anything, let that be enough. That is enough. It always was. The scroll made it. Through everything, it made it. 5 meters of paper and 7 panels and 1 printed date and 1 act of love and 900 years of darkness and a contested journey and careful hands in a London archive and the long patient work of people who believed that what was made in 868 was worth keeping. It made it to tonight. To this room. To you here, with the day behind you and the body growing heavier and the mind still doing what the mind does, which is move. Let it move. Let the thoughts be what they are, conditioned things, arising and passing, dream and bubble and shadow and dew, and let them keep moving without requiring them to land. The Buddha in the frontispiece is still sitting. Subhūti is still listening. The morning in a vast is still quiet and gold. And you are here, in your own dark, in your own quiet, at the end of a day that was whatever it was, difficult or easy or somewhere in between, remarkable or ordinary, marked or unmarked, and you do not have to grade it. You do not have to decide how well it went, or whether you handled it correctly, or what you should have done differently. The day is finished. It arose, and it passed. It was what it was, a flash of lightning, the sutra says. Not a diminishment, an honest description. It happened, it lit something briefly, and now the dark is here, which is not a punishment. The dark is here, because this is what comes after lightning, because this is the nature of the sequence. Because rest follows effort, the way night follows day, the way the sealed cave followed the busy scriptorium, and the long silence followed the sealing, and the opening followed the silence. In its time. In its time. Your time tonight is rest. Your instruction tonight, from the oldest printed book in the world, pressed into paper by someone who loved his parents and wanted to give something away, is to let go. Not of everything forever, not of the people you love, or the work you care about, or the self that will return tomorrow with its needs and its plans and its ordinary, continuous, astonishing task of being alive. Just tonight, just now. Just this grip, this slight tension at the edges of the hands and the jaw and the thought that is trying to stay held. Just this. Just a little looser. Just for the night. You have been holding things since morning. You can set them down. We have been together tonight through the carved wooden block and the pressed paper and the colophon that named a date in May of 868 and a man who loved his parents and let his gift go. Through the 7 panels of the scroll and the image of the Buddha and Subhūti facing each other in the golden morning of Śrāvastī. Through Kumārajīva translating in his study. Finding the words that would carry the teaching into Chinese, the words that would eventually reach Wang Jie's hands and the carver's hands, and the ink and the press. Through the mountain of Mogao and the nearly 500 caves carved by human hands over 1,000 years, painted and filled with light and intention, and then, in the case of Cave 17, sealed through the long darkness. Through Wang Yuanlu finding the room and not quite knowing what to do with what he found. Through the contested journey and the London archive and the careful conservation and the digitization that made the scroll visible to the world again. Through Huining stopping in the middle of a firewood delivery because a line from this text reached him and something came undone in the best possible way. Through the four notions, the raft at the shore, the answer of not the slightest thing, the tears of Subhūti, who understood what he was being told and was moved by it the way we are moved by things that are true. And through the closing verse, which is still settling. A dream, an illusion, a bubble in a stream, a shadow, dew on the grass at dawn, a flash of lightning in a dark sky, all conditioned things, all the arising and passing of a world made from causes and conditions, each thing depending on the next thing for its existence, each thing impermanent, not as a flaw, but as a nature, not as a loss, but as the way things actually are when you look at them, without the need for them to be otherwise. You have been listening to the oldest printed book in the world tell you gently, through all these pages and panels and centuries and hands, that holding on to nothing is not poverty. It is freedom, that the raft is for crossing, that the mind can arise without dwelling, that Subhūti's tears were tears of release, not of sorrow, that Wang Jie, in giving away his scroll and asking nothing in return, understood something about how love actually works. It moves through you and onward. It does not require a name or a monument or a record of having been given. It simply goes. Let the breath go. Let the body go heavier. Let the mind keep moving. If it needs to move, it will settle when it settles. The way water settles when you stop disturbing it. Not because you decided it should, but because that is what water does. The scroll is resting tonight. In its archive, in its careful climate, in its condition of having been preserved and digitized and studied and released again into the world. Wang Jie's date is still printed inside it. The Buddha and Subhūti are still in the frontispiece, still mid-conversation, still in a morning that has not ended, because it was never only a morning in 868. It has been every morning since, every time someone reads these words and pauses and understands that the question Subhūti asked is still a good question, and the answer the sutra gives is still a good answer. How should one stand and walk and still the mind? Without dwelling, without clinging, without requiring the conditioned things to be other than conditioned, the impermanent to be other than impermanent, the dream to be other than a dream. This is the gift. It was made for universal free distribution. It was sealed in darkness for 900 years, which did not diminish it. It was carried across a desert and an ocean and an argument about custody and a conservator's worktable. And tonight it found you, in the dark, at the end of a day, at the beginning of whatever rest is coming. Let it find you. Let the last lamp go down. Subject closed for the night. Let it all relax away.